This is in celebration of the life and work of Kamau Brathwaite. My name is Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o. I'm currently Distinguished Professor of English and Comparative Literature, University of California, Irvine. I wear many hats, which include teaching, of course, and also writing novels and plays. So I'm a writer really from Kenya, working in the USA. And every time I think of Kamau Brathwaite, my thoughts take me back to 1972, when Kamau, then Edward Brathwaite, came to the Department of Literature at Nairobi University, Kenya, on a City of Nairobi fellowship. The department was undergoing tremendous changes. We were trying to break away from the old colonial tradition that emphasized our colonial connections to Europe as primary, but not our natural connections to Africa and the rest of the world. Rebellion against this was the basis of the 1969 Nairobi Declaration calling for the abolition of the English department as then constituted, and for its restructuring along entirely new lines. By 1972, we had started breaking away from the centrality of English literature in our syllabus to a new dispensation that emphasized the centrality of the African experience at home on the continent and abroad in the Caribbean, Afro-America, and other parts of the world. Call it the African presence in the world. And I believe Kamau was the voice of that African presence. We wanted a dialogue among all the literatures of the entire Pan-African universe, and between them and those of South America, Asia, and Europe, in that order. Other needs arose from the new centrality. For instance, instead of inviting Shakespearean scholars from England, we now wanted scholars from the rest of Africa, and from the Caribbean, and from Afro-America. Who was going to be our first visitor? I had met Edward Brathwaite in London, 1966, when I was doing research on Caribbean literature at Leeds University. I then did not know that at different but crucial moments in our literary lives, he and I had both been influenced in a fundamental way by one of the classics of Barabajan and Caribbean literature, George Lamming's In the Castle of My Skin. In fact, Kamau Brathwaite and George Lamming come from the same island, Barbados. For me, Kamau's brilliant poems in Rites of Passage, out in 1967, followed by Masks in 1968, and Islands in 1969, had added to the sense of self-discovery I'd felt with George Lamming's novel In the Castle of My Skin. But Kamau's collections became part of the new syllabus. There was in fact something about their content and form that made everybody feel that they fitted the historical moment. That is, this, our search for a connection. So there was really little doubt as to who we wanted as our first scholar of what we saw as the beginnings of a new era. Brathwaite was then teaching history at the University of the West Indies, the Mona campus in Jamaica. We were very excited when he accepted our invitation. And he proved to be a great teacher. He saw no barriers between geography, history, and literature. What formed African and Caribbean sensibility could not be divorced from the landscape and the historical experience. This, to me, is still one of the most remarkable elements in the life and work of Kamau Brathwaite. He is a connecting spirit. Europe, Africa, the Caribbean, and now America are all important landmarks in his life and thought find expression in his work in their impact on one another. He explores the African presence in Africa, the Caribbean, and the world, not in its staticness, but in its movement, in its changingness, in its interactions with other forces. In these interactions, the African presence is not a passive element, whether across the Sahara deserts, through the savannas and tropical forests, across the Atlantic, say, in all its continental and diasporic dimensions. It is a resisting spirit, refusing to succumb, ready to rebuild anew from the ashes of natural disasters and human degradation. In his work, taken as a whole, the physical cannot be divorced from the metaphysical, the material from the religious. In his capacity to move freely from geography to history, to literature, to cultural criticism, Brathwaite exemplifies a great tradition of the Caribbean intellectual, the tradition of C.L.R. James, Frantz Fanon, Walter Rodney, Amy Zazea, George Lamming, to mention just a few who readily come to mind. But it was when Edward Brathwaite performed sections from his poems that we truly appreciated what we had been sensing. The voice. We were being mesmerized by the voice of orature. We were captives of a heritage we knew so well, but from which our education had been alienating us. His voice was returning us to our formative roots in orature. This was what had been created by our mothers and fathers, and it was there in his performance for us all to see. This orality runs through Brathwaite's entire work, and it's what gives it its very distinctive quality. This comes out powerfully through performance and makes us realize that in his literary output, Brathwaite gropes for the word in its oral purity. And then something happened during his visit, and this one I'll never forget. I invited Brathwaite to my rented home in Tigoni, Limuru, where I was born. The land around Tigoni and Limuru is truly beautiful. Not surprisingly, Tigoni was fairly central to Kenya's history because it was one of the earliest bones of contention between the British colonial settlers and Kenyans. The fact that now, in the 70s, Tigoni was occupied by African landlords symbolized that Kenya was no longer exclusively a white man's country. Brathwaite was coming into an area hallowed with memories of intense struggles. And it turned out to be a big welcome, with the faculty and some students driving 30 kilometers from Nairobi to attend the gathering. Women, led by my mother Wanjiko, came from all the villages around. So the peasants from the villages and the men and women of letters from Nairobi, the big city, now gathered in this rural outpost to celebrate Brathwaite's presence. Ceremonial goats were slaughtered in his honor. The women performed. Naming Brathwaite became the heart of the ceremony, which was also symbolically appropriate. For the right to name ourselves, our landscape, the struggle for the means with which to name ourselves, the right and the process and the means to name our world are behind his notion of the nation language, that submerged language of the enslaved, which through evolutionary and at times revolutionary subversion of the dominating asserts itself, often changing the character of what was supposed to be the mainstream. My mother and all the peasants who welcomed him in 1972 and gave him his name were asserting through song and dance that he was being welcomed in the lands where his ancestral umbilical cord had been buried. Though Kamau has passed on, his spirit lives with us, for we are celebrating years of a continuous creative output in theater, poetry, criticism, and history. We are celebrating a producer who, through journals like Savaku, has created forums for others. We are celebrating a teacher who has drawn from and given back to Africa, the Caribbean, Europe, and the USA. We are celebrating a gifted individual who believes in a collective spirit as seen in his work as a founding spirit of efforts like the Caribbean arts movement. They are rather expressions of a searching spirit, searching for the connective link in the human life and struggles. We are celebrating a most courageous man who has gone through personal adversities without succumbing to the death of the spirit. This spirit will continue to inspire us to join hands so that individually and collectively we, to paraphrase him, can make here on these broken grounds something torn and new.